Glad to welcome on the podcast for the first time, Erik Skopil from Duck Territory, who covers Oregon for 24/7 Sports. Erik, we got Big Ten Media Days, and now Oregon's an official member. So I guess I should tell you, welcome to the Big Ten. How does it feel? How does it feel for Ducks fans to be a Big Ten member now?
I think you're the first Big Ten, member school journalist to welcome me. So thank you, Jeremy. This is significant. It feels really weird, especially as somebody who's grown up in Eugene, lived on the West Coast pretty much for all 35 years, a little bit of time, maybe in other parts of the country. But to say that Oregon and Washington, USC and UCLA aren't playing primarily on the West Coast is very, very strange. And the idea that hopping on a flight for 4 or 5 hours to Indianapolis is like the new norm for Big Ten Media Days, because usually I could catch a direct to Vegas, which was an hour and a half flight. So things are changing. I think we'll get into it. A lot of things that I think are better from a football perspective for Oregon. A lot of these kind of tangential things I think are pretty silly and goofy, but hey, this is the situation we're at. And I'm thrilled for Oregon and Illinois. I think it played like one time in my lifespan and I was like 5 years old. So it's going to be fun to get to know some of these new programs and kind of get a feel for everything this fall.
Well, Erik, I mean, kids that are young, know Oregon is a powerhouse, but for, and we're younger, we're in our 30s. So obviously we know them as a pretty dang good program, but for much of its history, it was not like a college football powerhouse. But during the 21st century, it's been one of the best programs in the country. So what does the move to the Big Ten mean for the program?
Yeah, I mean, just a quick history. Oregon was pretty bad in football for my dad was a University of Oregon graduate, and he remembers a couple years after he graduated a 0-0 tie between Oregon and Oregon State that's been infamously known as the Toilet Bowl. This was kind of what happened. When, the kind of what started the momentum here was in 94 when Oregon, beat Washington at the end of a big rivalry game. Oregon and Washington are huge rivals as Big Ten fans we'll get to know more about, I think, going forward. But Oregon wins in 94 on a last second kind of pick six that seals it, and Phil Knight's in attendance, and he's an Oregon grad, but hasn't really been involved in Oregon football, and obviously one of the Nike founders, and he kind of decides let's go for it, and they end up getting crushed by Penn State in the Rose Bowl that year, but making it that far kind of started, I think, modern day Oregon football, and then Mike Bellotti showed and kind of took it up a level. Chip Kelly showed up, and they were competing for championships, and they've kind of been able to maintain that level through 3 or 4 head coaches since. And, I think the thought here is this move to the conference, this kind of, the evolution of NIL and the transfer portal all sort of plays in Oregon's favor in a way that I think for a lot of Oregon fans, they feel like Oregon's going to be one of the better teams in the country year in and year out. And that's not, even in this recent run, kind of been the norm. There've been kind of ebbs and flows. There's been some coaching shakeups which have impacted that, but they're recruiting better than just about ever. They're building teams through the portal just about better than ever. And I really think the move to the Big Ten is going to legitimize West Coast football, assuming they do well, which is the other part. Let's not get too far ahead of ourselves, but assuming that they play to the level people are expecting, I think there's a sense that this will mean a lot nationally in terms of how a 1 or 2 loss team on the West Coast is received, as opposed to what it was in the Pac-12, where a lot of times those teams are overlooked and not given opportunities. And we should also say the 12-team playoff kind of helps with that as well.
This might sound like a stupid question and a simple question, but I want to ask it. How important is Phil Knight to all of this at Oregon?
Very. Yeah, very. He's very involved, I think, for somebody in his 80s. I see him in the press box at every game. He's around practices pretty frequently. He's getting up there in age. I think there's a level of urgency to do something special. I think Oregon's very competitive with NIL. I mean, it's not just Phil, and some of the financial backing there, but it's the fact that Division Street, Oregon's NIL, the primary kind of NIL arm is run by Nike executives who'd worked in acquisitions with Nike athletes for 20 plus years. You know what I mean? So the people that are in charge of kind of putting together some of the financials and the logistics of it are people who have a lot of experience doing it. So Phil, the people that are in kind of his circles play a big role in terms of building this program. Obviously, today, they just released a new uniform set, and that has played a big role too. The relationship between Oregon and Nike with the uniforms, where they were one of the, kind of the first to throw out multiple uniform sets, different helmets, different jerseys, different pants every couple of games. So that part is huge. He's referred, familiarly to as Uncle Phil amongst Oregon fans and players and coaches and people around the program. So he's very present. I know he doesn't have a great reputation nationally because there's a sense Oregon's buying players. I get some of that, but for people in the state of Oregon, he means an awful lot.
All right, so Mario Cristobal leaves, goes home to Miami. Dan Lanning comes in, and I think some had questions of where Oregon would go from there. But Lanning is 22-5 the last 2 years. What has made him successful outside of all the financial support? What has made him successful as a coach?
Well, Dan brings like the Dan Lanning kind of origin story kind of, I think, lays out why he's been so successful. This is a guy who was like, I think, teaching middle school and coaching, like middle school football and, starting to coach high school football, kind of getting a foot in the door and went and drove like 12 hours from Kansas to I think Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, just to try to get, some sort of low end, probably non-paying job about 15 years ago. Ended up with Todd Graham at Arizona State, who was the Pitt coach turned Arizona State coach, and just kind of worked his way up from a GA to, recruiting analyst and kind of those sort of positions to eventually a position coach and then a coordinator at Georgia and leading one of, some of the better defenses in the last decade or so in college football. So this is a guy who's kind of worked his way up from his bootstraps. And he's talked about how he had to pull out like his teaching, the kind of the money he had from teaching to just kind of like support the family for a few years because he was, he wasn't making anything. So he's a grinder. I think that comes across a lot in recruiting. I think that comes across a lot in terms of how he kind of pushes the team and the players and the coaches around him, and he's built a really young, exciting coaching staff. I think I've talked about it kind of like an incubator for young coaching minds. He's very much attracted guys, and Dan's, I think, 37 or 38. And a lot of the guys on staff are younger than him, or, in their late 20s, early 30s, and guys who have aspirations to be, maybe in kind of Dan's shoes one day of kind of working their way up. So, he's built a staff that way and a team that way of kind of just, we're going to outwork everybody. And, there are probably some things he needs to shore up in terms of just like as an in-game coach. I mean, we talk about those losses. The two of them to Washington had some pretty questionable decisions in like fourth down. Like, he's a very aggressive coach, but I think ultimately you love the energy and the effort that he brings. And for Oregon, a program that has had a struggle with continuity. I mentioned earlier, like Mike Bellotti was here for, I think, about 15 years. And before that, Rich Brooks, the coach for that Rose Bowl team I was talking about back in '94, he was here for a couple decades. Well, Chip was here for 4 years, got run out of town largely because of the NCAA sanctions, looking into some of that stuff, and he ended up in the NFL. Helfrich probably wanted to be here for a long time, but he wasn't allowed that because the team totally cratered under him. Willie Taggart showed up for a year, and he took off. Mario Cristobal was here for 4 years, and he went back to Florida, down to Miami, where he's from. And so the stability also of Lanning saying, I'm going to be here for a while, I'm going to commit to that. And obviously most recognizably the decision to pass on Alabama to stay at Oregon. I think those sort of things have really bought him a lot of goodwill, both locally and regionally.
Well, let's look at this year. To me, I look at these teams, given where they are, and Oregon, of the 4 incoming Pac-12 teams, looks like they're set up most for success right away in the Big Ten. What are expectations in Oregon for year one in the Big Ten Conference?
Well, Oregon's become a program where they want to make the playoff. They played for 2 national championships in the last about 15 years, and Chip brought Oregon to a game against Cam Newton and Auburn after the 2009 season, and then Mark Helfrich coached them to a loss in the very first college football playoff against Ohio State, and that one kind of still sits wrong for Oregon fans. So I think trying to get back to the playoff, which is now significantly easier, with 12 teams being included, I think that's a focal point. I think really the games that Oregon fans are really curious about are Ohio State and Michigan, and just seeing how they stack up with these 2 programs that have been where Oregon wants to be. And we'll see how the year plays out. I think Oregon has a really talented roster. I think there's a lot of momentum around this program. I think there's reasons to believe that Oregon could beat both of those teams. I don't think losing to one, maybe losing to both would be seen as a disappointment, but if they can get through this run and feel pretty good about how they've stacked up against Ohio State and Michigan, and I'll throw maybe Wisconsin in there, I think they'll feel pretty darn good about it. And then it's got to make the college football playoff and try to show something when you do get there.
So they lose Bo Nix, number 12 pick in the draft, quarterback, Bucky Irving, kid from Chicago, Troy Franklin. But they bring in Dylan Gabriel, who's thrown for a lot of yards in college, 5-star quarterback Dante Moore, 5-star transfer wide receiver Evan Stewart. What do you think of this kind of retooled, and I use retooled, not rebuilt offense, because, boy, they seem to have some weapons.
Yeah, and I think the cool thing with Oregon, I kind of mentioned the way they're kind of building up coaches is Kenny Dillingham was a 31-year-old offensive coordinator at Oregon in Dan's first year. He took the job at Arizona State, a head coaching position. And they brought in Will Stein, I believe a 31-year-old offensive coordinator who hadn't had a lot of experience this past year. And just immediately you kind of saw, man, they struck gold twice with these young, really thoughtful, kind of confident young play callers who are clearly both destined to be head coaches, probably in short order. And I think with just having Will here now for a little bit more time, a little continuity, obviously there's some roster churn at quarterback, which is never easy, but that's a position that Will played. He played at Illinois, or sorry, not at Illinois. This is an Illinois podcast. He played at Louisville. Yeah. And so he's got a little bit of a playing experience. And I think that, especially with Bo, kind of bought him some trust. And I expect that'll be the same with Dylan. And I think the offense and the way it operates is very player friendly. This is we're going to get the ball out to guys in space. I know Bo took a lot of criticism last year, especially from people down in like Louisiana and maybe in Seattle about the ODOT. How far is he throwing the ball downfield? And that was certainly a fair criticism at times, because this is an offense where it was, let's get the ball out quick to our skilled players and let them go. And I happen to think that they've upgraded a lot of the skill positions this year. I think replacing Bucky Irving will be difficult. He was one of, I think, the more dynamic athletes Oregon has had at that position probably since LaMichael James was here. But Jordan James has been waiting in the wings, and I think that's a player people are really excited about. Noah Whittington comes back. That's another player people are excited about. And then receiver, it feels crazy to say they've upgraded because Troy Franklin broke a bunch of school records last year. But, Tez Johnson is really underregarded, I think, nationally. This is a guy who is Bo Nix's adopted younger brother. He had another great season last year, over 1,000 yards, 10 touchdowns, set the school record for receptions in a season. I think he had 82. So this is a guy who, along with Evan Stewart, I think gives them some real big play opportunity on the outside. And they're really deep at receiver this year is the other thing. I think you're going to use 6 or 7 guys, and several of those guys are players Oregon fans are really excited to see.
A lot of, the Big Ten reputation is, hey, they win in the trenches. They have that. I mean, the SEC obviously is that way too. And the West Coast teams are always, the offense teams, but it seems like Oregon has some strength in the trenches, right? Like doesn't feel like they're coming in quite like USC has struggled in the trenches. Feels like Oregon's a little more built up there.
Yeah, and that started with Mario Cristobal. Oregon fans aren't big fans of his because he took off in the manner he did, which was abrupt, and it happened not that long before with Willie Taggart in sort of similar fashion heading back home. But Mario Cristobal brought a certain mentality to Oregon. He probably didn't. Those teams more resembled like a Big Ten or an SEC team where the offense wasn't very explosive. They had Justin Herbert, and the gripe the whole time was, why aren't this guy can throw like 100 yards in the air? Why isn't he throwing the ball downfield? And it was just kind of short check down stuff and kind of a simple offense. But boy, did they get after people at the line of scrimmage. And those offensive lines were really, really strong. And I think Dan's sort of taken some of that in terms of continuing to focus on building up some size and strength on the offensive line. I think this last year, Oregon was one of the Joe Moore Award finalists. They had the Remington Award winner in Jackson Powers Johnson, who's now with the Las Vegas Raiders. So they had some real talent last year on the offensive line, and they bring back some great players. I think their 2 offensive tackles, Josh Connerly and Johnny Cornelius, are going to be 2 of the better tackles in the country. They'll have to shore up some stuff in the interior. Losing Powers Johnson is not going to be easy to replace, but it's an offensive line I think they feel really good about. And then the other side is where things are kind of interesting, where they lost, I think, 4 or 5 of their most played interior defensive linemen from last year. And that was a pretty good unit out west. It was one of the better against the run. Really stood up well most games throughout the season. Lost a lot of guys, but they've hit the portal hard. They've recruited the position really, really well. I think they've had 8 or 9 blue chip interior defensive line recruits the last 2 cycles. And so there's some optimism that they can stack up there. I think, if you're kind of looking at Oregon just from, a bird's eye view and kind of trying to pick apart where they're susceptible, I think offensively it's the interior of that offensive line, and defensively it's like, okay, they added Derek Harmon, who was a pretty highly regarded transfer from Michigan State. They added Jamari Caldwell, again, pretty highly regarded guy from Houston. Are they going to be able to stack up in the Big Ten up front? It's a totally different group. And then at the back end at safety, Oregon has, I think, some real concerns. I think those are kind of the spots that maybe are just kind of giving you a little bit of sleepless nights if you're looking at the season.
Erik, before I let you go, Illinois is a proud basketball school, probably that first more than anything. And Dana Altman at one point was a prime candidate for the Illinois job when Bill Self left more than 20 years ago. But finally, Illinois got it back going under Brad Underwood. But Dana Altman's still going strong at Oregon. Big bounce back here, getting to the NCAA tournament and winning a game there. Where's that program at, and how competitive do you think they'll be in the Big Ten right away?
They've recruited better than the results, probably. In this last year, you mentioned it being a bounce back year. I think there was optimism it could be a lot better than it was. They at one point were down like 4 starters, for like a big chunk of the season, and got a couple guys back. Like they played that game against Creighton in the second round where they lost with 6 healthy scholarship players, and then they lost one of the guys towards the end of the game. They were having to play walk-ons in the tournament, so it was kind of a year where it didn't come together the way it could have, but they return a lot of players from that team. They've added some pretty high-end transfers. They've recruited pretty well from the prep ranks consistently for the last 2 or 3 cycles. I think there's a sense like this should be a tournament team. I don't think there's the top end, like surefire NBA talent to compete for anything more than like a top 4 or 5 finish in the Big Ten. I think if they did better than that, I think people would be probably pretty surprised and pretty shocked, to be honest with you. But they have the talent, I think, to compete for, making a tournament run. And, I don't know, again, what the ceiling is in terms of Big Ten finish, but I do think they should be an upper half, which maybe isn't that impressive. Was that top 9 teams?
Still pretty impressive in what's going to be a pretty deep league here.
Yeah. Well, it's just funny because I'm used to saying top half in the Pac-12 where there's like a top 6 team as opposed to like, I think they're going to finish 8th, which is a great season. But to your point, maybe that would be a huge step forward just in terms of the overall depth of that conference.
Track we know is really strong at Oregon. Any other sports Illinois fans should know that, hey, Oregon's coming in with a lot of talent here.
A couple of years ago, I would have said women's basketball. Sabrina Ionescu really brought some special times. They recruited like a number 1 class, a number 2 class, and like 2 of the first 3 years after she left. That's completely fallen apart. Kelly Graves is probably coaching for his job, so I won't bring that up. Baseball and softball programs are very strong. The volleyball program was strong for a Pac-12 school. We'll see if they're strong for a Big Ten school. My suspicion is it probably won't be that strong. I think baseball and softball both have chances to be really, really competitive and compete for Big Ten titles. I think that's probably also the case for certainly UCLA and Washington, but I think and probably USC. I think all the West Coast teams are going to compete pretty well in baseball and softball. Track is a really interesting one, just because, not to go too far down a track tangent here, Jeremy, but if you're not aware, like they do the World Championships and the Olympic trials out here, and the facility is amazing if you've ever seen it on television. Well, the programs are kind of in a transitional period. They just made a coaching change a couple of years ago. And I would say the women's program is pretty competitive. I think they went top 5 at the NCAAs. The men's program is pretty terrible right now. Yeah. So I'm actually going to be curious to see how things go with the Big Ten and with Oregon track. I think the women will be very competitive and have a chance probably to win like a Big Ten championship, but the men might be kind of bad, which is weird because having grown up out here and going to meets at Hayward all my life, they've routinely been winning national championships and conference championships.
Well, Erik Skopil, thanks for getting us up to date on Oregon, new member of the Big Ten. Follow Erik, Duck Territory, is part of our 24/7 Sports Oregon page. You can follow him on Twitter at Erik_Skopil. Erik, appreciate the time, man.
Thanks, Jeremy. Nice to meet you guys.